Okay, so let's get going on today's class. So what we're going to do today is we're going to wrap up our look at critical thinking, or at least the critical thinking checklist. We're going to keep doing critical thinking throughout the entire semester, but we'll wrap up our look at the checklist, and then we're going to take a look at a very important resource that I want to make you aware of, which comes from Appendix A, reporting research, which is the one experiment sample paper, which will be one of your most useful guides as we go through writing our research paper. So once again, the purpose of these lectures this week is to take you from this situation when you're trying to write your research report to this situation where you know where everything needs to go, how do you get started, what information needs to be in there, eventually so that it's just a matter of doing the work, but you know what needs to be done. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with the library assignment preview. So this is the first little piece of knowledge that you're going to need to do the library assignment. Just want to make you aware of that. Then we're going to go through the checklist for the critical reader, which is also great for the critical writer. So when you're starting to read the articles that you get from your library assignment, be sure to practice this checklist. Be sure to practice. Is that the video that I'm going to be watching later?
No.
No? Okay. Be sure to use this checklist, and it will help you, number one, learn your critical thinking skills, practice them. It'll also help you process the information a lot more actively when you're reading your paper, when you're reading your articles, and it'll also help you become a better writer if you write to address this checklist for the critical reader. And then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to do an overview of the of APA style by taking a look at a resource that you have in your textbook, which is the sample paper, which is basically your visual guide to the way that your final research report should look. So let's start with the library assignment preview. When you do your library assignment, and I'll be making available the questions for the assignment. It's a guided search. So you're going to be asked to find articles using the psychology databases that we have here available to you to satisfy certain conditions. So they have to be within a certain number of years. They have to be by these particular authors. They have to cite a particular article. But all of them are going to share in common that they have to be primary research articles. And what a primary research article is it is the first publication of a research project. So it is the original source of the information. It's the original report of this information. It is the most reliable source for this information. So this primary article is usually only found in professional scientific journals. So it's not found in newspapers. If you're reading a newspaper about a new scientific study, you are not reading the primary research article. You're not reading the original publication. So you're not going to find it in newspapers. You're not going to find it in magazines, online or in print. It's not going to be on Wikipedia. Wikipedia does not have primary research articles published in Wikipedia. It's not going to be in many of the sources that you're used to going to for information. And this is because as part of our focus on critical thinking, we want to make sure that we get to the original source. So we're not dealing with other people's interpretations. We're not dealing with what they think was said. We can make that decision for ourselves, what was actually said in that primary research article. So it's usually only found in scientific journals. However, the challenge is that scientific journals publish other stuff as well. So a scientific journal will publish primary research articles, but it will also publish other articles, secondary research articles. So it'll publish things like literature reviews. These are exceptionally useful, especially if you're new to a field. So this is basically a synopsis of all the research that had been done in a particular area. And if you're new to a particular field like child development, if you're new to the field of memory, if you're new to the field of perception, these literature reviews are a great place to start because they will summarize 80, 90, 100 articles so that you can get an overview of the field. But it's somebody else's summary. It's somebody else reading through these articles saying, this is what I think they meant, this is what I think is important. So it's a great place to start, but you want to make sure that you get to that primary research article to find out for yourself. So scientific journals will publish literature reviews. They're not primary research articles. They'll publish book reviews. They'll be like, oh, here's the latest textbook from this person. Here's the latest handbook of, experimental psychology from this, from these researchers. Here's our book review. Those book reviews are not primary research articles. They'll publish editorials, statements on the state of, psychology in that area, statements on new challenges that are arising. Those are also not primary research articles. There'll be position papers where they might have people debating two sides of an argument, not primary research articles. They could have invited addresses. There's a ton of different types of articles that a scientific journal will publish, and they're not necessarily primary research articles. So you have to find these primary research articles for our research project. And just to show you, we saw the importance of the primary research article last time when we were looking at the misinterpretation of the Viking archaeological studies. So the original report said nothing about Viking warriors, but the media reported that it was about Viking warriors and therefore there were female Viking warriors. That's not what the original report said. I'll give you an example that goes closer to psychology. There was a classic study about childhood development and childhood nutrition. And in this study, what they showed, I'll tell you what they reported in the media first. What they reported in the media, what got told and was reported in textbooks, was reported in the newspapers, was reported in magazines. And what was true, what was the result of the study, was that children will balance their own diets if you give them freedom of choice. So if you just say to your child, here's food, eat, your child will balance their own diet. So you don't have to sit there and say, eat your vegetables, right? If a child feels like eating vegetables, it's because their body needs vegetables, they'll eat vegetables. You don't have to sit there and say, eat your meat, because if a child feels the need for meat, they'll eat meat. We have psychological processes that'll balance our own diet. In the original experiment that led to that result, it was only healthy foods. That was all that was available. So there was healthy fruit, there was healthy vegetables, healthy meats, healthy grains, healthy, dairy products, but it was all healthy choices. And given that subset of choices, subjects, children, would pick stuff and they would be healthy. Their diet would be balanced. They would pick the foods that they needed. What the secondary sources reported was not, they left out the healthy choices. And they reported that children will balance their own diets. And this gave countless parents the idea that if their child wanted to eat cookies, that's fine. They'll eventually not eat cookies because they'll balance their own diet. If they want this sugary cereal, that's fine. Let them eat sugary. If they want to eat these candy bars, that's fine because the scientific report said they'll balance their own diet. So why would I fight with them? Let them balance their own diet. They're going to do it anyway. That's because they read it in a secondary source and they did it wrong. And they did a disservice to these children who ended up with health issues because of this misreporting. So if it's important to you, for example, if it's for a research paper that you're publishing, you need to go to those primary articles. You need to go to the original research to take a look at it and say, oh my gosh, they only allow them to choose from healthy foods. I'm going to take the box of cookies away from my child because they will never make that choice. So we got to go to the first publication. So we have to know how to identify these first publications. So I'm going to give you a couple of tips, a couple of tricks that you can use to make this a little bit easier for your library assignment. So here they are. This is what you want to look for. This will allow you to identify a primary research article in about a minute so that you can select through articles that you find and very quickly say this one is not primary, this one is not primary, here's a primary one, not primary, here's primary. So this is what you want to look for. First off, you want to find the method section. And you want to see a method section that says something about the subject characteristics. So what you're going to do is open up the PDF. When we go to the library section, they'll show you how to get these articles. You open up the article and you just start scanning. You don't even have to read it. You just start scanning down for the word methods, right in bold, right in the middle of the column. If you don't find the word methods, it's not primary research. Primary research will have a methods section. If you find a methods section, then you also then have to check, does it say something about the subject characteristics? Does it mention how many subjects? We ran 62 subjects. We tested 142 subjects. Does it mention the number? Does it mention how many males and female subjects? 42 males and 87 females participated in this experiment. Does it mention what their average ages were? The average age of 26 and a half, average age of 7.2 years old. That's what you're looking for. Because occasionally a review paper will have a methods section, but it will not have anything about subject characteristics, right? Meta-analyses will have a methods section, but nothing about subject characteristics. So the first step is find that methods section. Second step, you should see a subsection that says we had this many subjects, this many males and females, this was the average age. You might not get all three pieces of information, but if you don't have a single one of these, not a primary research paper, you got to go to another source. So that's one of the first things you can look for. This will get you to about like 90% sure that you're dealing with a primary research paper. The next thing you want to look at is you scroll a little bit down, a little bit further, and you're looking for a big, bold title that says results. It'll be bold, it'll be in the center of the column, and you want a results section that contains statistical jargon. So you might not know what any of this means yet, and that's fine, but you can recognize stuff that's not English. And that's what you're looking for. You're looking for that statistical jargon. So you're looking for stuff like p-values. You're looking for stuff like f-values, t-values, other abbreviations, partial eta squared, chi-squared. You're looking for all these statistical notations. You're looking for numbers, right? You should actually see numbers being reported somewhere. P equals 0.05, T equals 2.73. You're looking for numbers as well. If you find stuff that looks like this, then that raises it to about 99% that you're dealing with a primary research article. And notice you didn't even read anything, right? All you read was methods. Here are the subjects, results. Here are some numbers and some jargon. Takes you about a minute, 2 minutes to do this, and you know whether you're dealing with a primary research article or whether you're not dealing with that primary research article. All right, so any questions about those two kind of signposts for that primary research article? Make sense? All right, so I hope when the library assignment comes, remember those two criteria, and when you hand it in, there will be points for making sure that it's a primary research article. So, I'm glad to see, and I'm hoping that we'll get everybody finding all 4 articles, all primary research. All right, so now we're switching gears away from the library assignment to what you're going to do afterwards. So once you find your articles, these are the articles that are going to form the background research of your research paper. So we need to write about something. We need to write about false memories. We need to write about group cognition. This is where you're going to find that information in these articles. So it's going to require you to read these articles, and we want to start developing those skills so we can read it as a critical thinker, as a critical reader. Because as we saw last time, you can't take the source of the information anymore as a guarantee that it's good information. So we saw this last time. Nicholas Gueguen You'll never find out unless you meet him at a conference. Like, nobody knows how to pronounce half of the scientists' names. Anyways, this women's hairstyle and men's behavior field experiment was published in a peer-reviewed, respected journal. However, when people, and not a lot of people, not everybody knows this, but when people read this and they critically thought about the information, they engaged with the information, as we saw last time, 2 readers noticed that there was very suspicious data. So when the averages were reported, and that's what these numbers here are, when the averages were reported for 90 pedestrians, male pedestrians, and 90 female pedestrians, what they found was that it just was very coincidental that every single average ended in 0. Right? That might happen for one of the averages, but to add up 90 numbers and get an average of the average that ends in point something 0, and for it to happen 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different in 6 different situations in a row, that only happens 1 in 714 times. So the implication is that this could have happened by chance, but there's a 713 and 714 chance that this is fabricated data. So again, you can't take the fact that it's published in a scientific journal as a guarantee that the data is credible. We have to engage with it and think about, what does it mean? What does this data actually say? So that's kind of an open-ended statement. You want to engage with it. You want to be critical when you think about it. So how do we do that? That's where the checklist comes in. So these are very helpful questions for when you're reading, very helpful questions for when you're writing. This is basically a checklist that you want to go through at the end of every section. And to try to answer these questions for every section is going to help you engage and understand the material. So when you're reading, try to use this checklist. When you're writing, also use this checklist. We're going to give you more details in terms of what the outline is. But your writing should be clear enough, and it should have enough information that if you gave your writing to somebody who had never read this before, they should be able to answer all the questions on this checklist. And again, it helps engage your critical thinking processes. So let's take a look at what this checklist is. We'll start off with the first section, which is the introduction. As you read the introduction, and definitely by the end of the introduction, you should be able to answer the following 3 questions. So they all include, or they all can be answered with information from the introduction. First question, what is the author's goal? So by the end of the introduction, you should be able to answer, what is this author trying to do? What question are they trying to answer? What piece of psychological information are they trying to discover? What theory are they trying to test? What's the purpose of this paper existing? You should be able to answer that. If you cannot, by the time you finish the introduction, you missed something. You haven't. There's a piece of information that you didn't process. You have to go back. You have to find out that information. If you're writing this, and at some point you don't specify what your goal is, so if this is you as a writer, and you don't at some point say, we're trying to answer the question of how does false memory affect memory in groups, your introduction is incomplete. So again, it can be used to help you read, it can be used to help you write. So what is the author's goal? What's the purpose of this paper? What are they trying to accomplish? Number 2, what hypothesis will be tested in the experiment? So what hypothesis, what if-then statement is going to be tested? Saying, if this theory is true, and we do this to subjects, then this will occur. You should be able to state that. You should be able to say, if the Smith and Smith theory is true, and they ask subjects to fill out the Beck's depression inventory, then we should see these scores should occur. So you might have one hypothesis, you might have 2, you might have 3. There's depending upon how many theories are being tested, but there's going to be at least one, and you should be able to identify it. You should be able to state it in the, if this theory is true, and they do this to the subjects, then this outcome should occur. So you should be able to do that. And then one of the commonalities for each section of this checklist is that the last part of each checklist asks you to guess the next part of what it is that you're about to read. And this is probably the most important part in terms of engaging your critical thinking processes. So in this case, we're reading the introduction. The next step up, the next section up is the method section. The next section is what they did, what design did they use in their experiment. But before you read that, you want to ask yourself, if I had to design an experiment to test this hypothesis, what would I do? And if you don't answer this before reading the method, it's really difficult to unring that bell and figure out what you would have thought before you heard that new information. So it's kind of like when you were kids and you were trying to figure out if somebody was going to be your best friend for life. So you would ask them, what's your favorite band, what's your favorite movie, what's your favorite TV show? But you wouldn't let them answer second. You have to answer at the same time. Because if they're like, well, what's your favorite TV show? And you're like, Stranger Things. And they're like, yeah, me too. That doesn't carry a lot of weight. But if they say it at the same time, then you know you're onto something. Same thing here. If you come up with a method section after you read their method section, 99 times out of 100, you're going to say, that's a pretty good idea what they did. Because it's hard to unring that bell. But if you say to yourself, all right, based on what I read, if I had to design an experiment, what would I do? And you just come up with an idea. You just say, I would take two groups of subjects. I would treat one group like this, one group like this. I would measure them in this way. And then I would compare those two, on this dependent measure. If you just come up with something as simple as that, you then have a memory, a mental model that you have created that you can then compare to what it is that you read later. And that way you can see discrepancies, and they're a lot more readily apparent than if you just have a vague idea and then you read their methods and you're like, well, of course, that's what I would have done too, because what else is there? So in each of these sections, you'll see that last question, guess what's coming up next. Figure out what you would do, and then write it down or be very clear about it in your head. Because what you want to do is, once you get that down, you go to the next section. And the first question here is, my proposed method better than the author's? You're not going to be able to answer that unless you propose the method. So the first one is, my proposed method better than the author's requires you to be very clear on what you would have done, what you thought would be a good idea. And then take a look at what they did. And you can see any discrepancies. And that'll engage your critical thinking. Why did they do it that way? Is it actually better? That's that's the first one. Is it actually better than what I thought? Is it worse than what I thought? It lets you make those kinds of comparisons. Number 2, does the author's method actually test a hypothesis? You would be surprised how often this is not the case. So the authors, might say something like, well, we're going to test memory, in groups. And you get to the method section and you're like, you're not testing memory, you're testing confidence. Like you're asking them about confidence. You said you were going to test memory. You'd be surprised how often that actually happens. So ask yourself, the method that they made, if it differs from mine, does it actually test the hypothesis? It might not, in which case, not such a good experiment. But again, that's that idea of that critical thinking process. And then lastly, if I had to design an experiment to test this hypothesis, what would I do? Now that you've come up with your idea, now that you've seen their idea, see if you can improve on it, right? Again, actively engage and see, given everything that you've read, is this the best way to do it? Maybe we shouldn't do it this way. Maybe we should do it in a different way. So one thing that is often overlooked, but you should pay attention to it, are the characteristics of the subjects. Oftentimes, in the experiments that are published in psychology, we get our subjects from the students that are enrolled in our psychology major. And that means that the characteristics of the subjects through time change with the demographics of individuals that take psychology. So if you read studies from the 60s and from the 70s, you will see in the description of the subjects, we had 80 males, we had 20 females. We had 70 males, we had 30 females. We had mostly males and fewer females. You read articles today, published recently, or just take a look around the room, and it's the complete opposite. We had 80 females, 20 males. We had 70 females, 30 males. Maybe that's an issue. Maybe you'll say to yourself, if I had to design an experiment to test this hypothesis, it seems like gender issues might be influencing the results. Maybe I would have 50-50, if I could do it. So again, helps you engage in that critical thinking process to think of what is it that you should be doing. And then, lastly, using the subjects, apparatus or materials, and procedures described by the author. So given what the author just told me, what you just read, what results would I predict for the experiment? The results section is the next one that's coming up. Right? So given the introduction that you read and the methods that you just finished reading, you should be able to say, this is what I predict should occur. And that needs to be done before you read what actually occurred. Because again, you cannot unring that bell and think about, well, what would I have thought before I heard this? That's nearly impossible. So make sure that you predict it beforehand and say that I predict this group should score higher than this group. I predict that there should be no difference between the two of them based on what I've read so far. And then that will help you do two things. Number one, it'll prepare your mind for the results because the results are hard. Results are challenging. But if you're already thinking about this should be higher than this, that one should be lower than that, it helps get your mind ready. And then number two, you're going to be able to very quickly realize what's surprising, what's unusual, what's unexpected. Right? What is, the big sort of story in the results. So that's the method section. So we're done. We try to guess what's going to happen in the results, and then we read the results. So, number 6. Yep.
So then would you be skipping over the abstract when you go to read an article? Because doesn't the abstract sometimes give away the results?
That's a good point. If you want to fully apply this, yes. You actually would. I'll be honest with you, I never do that because I read the abstract to see if I want to read the article, right. Because you need to know whether it's exactly that. I guess being told a little bit about what happened wouldn't offset this too much, but you're absolutely right. I mean, if you want to go for the full critical thinking attack, skip the abstract. It's a good point. Skip the title then too, because good titles will oftentimes have at least a part of the results. Right, so a bad title, we'll discuss this when we get to title pages later on, but a bad title or an ineffective title would be something like, the effects of social media on depression, right? So it's social media, it's depression, but it really doesn't tell you anything. A better title would be something like, high social media users have lower depression. Something like that would actually give you the direction. So that's a better title. So, I guess that gives you some of the results, but yeah, that's a good point. You are critically thinking about the checklist. This checklist should have skip the abstract. That's step number 1. Okay, so back to the checklist at hand. Did the author get unexpected results? Can't answer that unless you've already tried to guess what the results should be. And then, did the author get unexpected results? That you get from the introduction to method and the results. And then 7A, 7B, and 7C is you trying to guess the discussion. So 6 is, do the numbers that they report match up with the numbers that you predicted? 7 is, what do those numbers mean? So how would I interpret the results? So this group is higher than this group. What does that mean? These two groups are the same. What does that mean? Does it support the theories in the introduction? Does it refute the theories? Does it partially support? What do these results mean? You try to interpret the results first. What applications and implications would I draw from my interpretation? of the results. So in our group memory experiment, what applications can you use for this? What instances of people working in groups in society would this affect? Juries, board meetings, group therapy, study groups, political rallies, other places where groups come together and try to remember things. What are some of the implications that you would have? Because again, when you read an implication, when you read that other information, it kind of closes off your mind sometimes to those possibilities. And then finally, is there an alternative explanation for the results? Is there some other factor that could have accounted for the results? Is there some other unmeasured or unaccounted for variable that could have caused this? Could the results have changed because of who ran the experiment? So see if there is some sort of alternative explanation, some other interpretation of the results that you can come up with. And then once you figure out how you would interpret the results, how you would do the applications and implications, how you might say, might identify alternative explanations. Basically, when you decide how you would write the discussion section for this paper, then you can go read the discussion section. So does my interpretation or the author's better represent the data? That's a very important question. You, again, be surprised how often the authors miss or don't interpret the data correctly. So I'm reminded of a conference presentation that was tweeted and about, and what they showed was they measured the gender equality across a bunch of different countries, and then they measured the gender difference in performance on a spatial task. And this spatial task had been shown that males were better at this spatial task than females. That was a kind of consistent finding. And what they found was that the larger the inequality between males and females in a society, the larger the difference between their ability on this spatial task. So they measured the inequality of males and females in these different countries, and then they measured males and females' ability to do this task in different countries, and they correlated the data. And hopefully everybody knows that correlation does not equal causation, right? Hopefully everybody's heard that. We'll hear it again when we take a look at correlation in this class. But correlation does not imply causation. Everybody that I saw, all the scientists that were in that Twitter thread, were all talking about how the gap in the tests is being caused by the inequality. And the inequality, the patriarchy, the unfair treatment of the different genders was causing the gap, but it was correlational. You can't make that conclusion. So their interpretation was dangerous. It was not allowed. You're not allowed to imply or conclude causation from correlation. So you'd be surprised how often that happens when the data fits a certain narrative. Just human beings run with it occasionally, and scientists are human beings. So 8A, does my interpretation or the author's better represent the data? 8B, do I or the author offer a more cogent discussion of the applications and implications of the results? Sometimes an author will miss what their results really mean. Sometimes they'll miss what, how to apply the stuff that they found. Sometimes they'll miss it just because they published this article in a time before the technology allowed them to make these implications. So you might be reading a study from the 60s, from the 70s, that could have massive implications to our world of social media. Those authors weren't going to give you that implication because it didn't exist back then. So do you have better applications or implications of the results? And then 8C, what questions are left unanswered? This is more an exercise, again, in critical thinking, because there are always questions left unanswered. And if you ever wonder, where does a researcher get their ideas? If you're when you're doing your advanced lab and somebody asks you, what research project do you want to do? And you're sitting there going, I don't know. Where does a researcher come up with their ideas? They come up with their ideas at the end of a discussion. They read the end of the discussion section and say, they missed out. They forgot about this. They didn't answer this question. Maybe I'll do that study and try to answer that question. And that one leads right into this one. What additional studies might I do? You would do the additional studies that answered those unanswered questions. So you can see that these ones link directly back to question 7A, 7B, and 7C. And this is the sort of checklist that you should have when you're reading your research papers. So I would highly recommend print out these 4 slides so that you can have them next to you, or have your textbook open to this checklist so you can have it next to you so you can just kind of follow along. And when you're reading your research papers, this will help you navigate them, because it might seem like more work at the beginning, but if you are thinking about these questions as you read, especially, let's go back to the introduction one real quick. If you're thinking about these questions as you read the introduction, you will more likely process information that will help you answer these questions. So if you've ever read a page of something, some required reading, if you've ever read a page and then at the end of it, you think to yourself, what did I just read? I can't even remember. What was the last sentence? I'm kind of blanking here. It's because you weren't actively engaging with the material. So when you have a goal, when you have questions, when you're sitting there going, what is the author's goal? Let me find this. And what is the hypothesis that they're testing? Let me make sure I'm looking for that. It'll actually help you make sense of this, because, reading articles, they are more challenging than your textbook. They're at a higher sort of level than your textbook information is. So it is going to be a little bit of a challenge when you first start. So I would highly recommend go in there with, what is the author's application and implications? Are mine better? Where are the unanswered questions? Keep that in mind as you're reading through. It'll help you process that information. All right, so that's the checklist for the critical reader. Any questions on that before we go to our sample paper? All right. So the next thing I want to do is go through this sample paper, and we're just going to highlight some of the characteristics that we're going to be looking for in the final research paper. We're going to highlight some of the APA style that you'll be responsible for in the final paper. And this is more to make you aware of our end goal. Don't for a second think that you are responsible for this right off the get-go. So when we write our first method section, we're only going to have like 2 or 3 pieces of APA style that we're going to incorporate into the first method section. When we get to the results section, we're going to add a little bit about numbers. When we get to the discussion, we're going to add a little bit about citations. When we get to the introduction, we'll add a little bit more. So we're going to roll it out, but this is going to be a sort of like, this is the end of it kind of preview. But don't feel overwhelmed. So in the sample paper, style that you're going to be responsible for, I'm going to highlight it in green. Styles that you're not going to be responsible for, I'll have the little no circle there. And this is available in your textbook. And this is a highly valuable resource. It is probably the best visual aid that you can have in terms of what your paper is going to look like. So the first thing I want to point out is that when you write a paper, your paper is going to look different than when you read a published article. So when you read a published article, it's published in APA form, APA style, but different journals will have different publication styles. There's no title page in the journals that are published. So this is what's known as manuscript form, and then you have the other published form. We're going to learn manuscript form because unless you become an editor of a journal, you don't have to worry about publication form. So you'll notice that there's differences, but if you ever need a visual guide to what you're writing, don't go to a published paper because it's not necessarily going to be correct. Go to this one experiment sample paper because this is your best guide in terms of how things should look. So, for example, this is your title page right here. Notice that it has what's called a running head. So it says here, the running head is a shortened version of the title, up to 50 characters, including spaces. The title page shows the words running head followed by a shortened version of the title in caps. So you can read that description, and it tells you exactly what you need to do. But then you can also, with this resource, just take a look at it and say, oh, okay, so that's what a running head looks like. Running head here, getting a bigger slice, all in capitals. Okay, I get it, I know what it looks like. So when you're putting your paper together, take a look at this resource and make sure that your paper looks like this paper. And it's a great visual guide to use. So we're gonna have running heads. We're gonna have page numbers. So you might be asking yourself, do I number the first page number 1, or is it the second page is number 1? Does the title page count? Yep, title page counts. It's right up there. Title page is number 1, and it's in your upper right-hand corner. The title is usually no more than 12 words, so we're going to place a limit on how long the title can be. Title and author and affiliations are centered and appear in the upper half of the page. So this is a phrase that I think catches a lot of students. Centered in the upper half of the page. What does centered in the upper half of the page mean? Does that mean that is it here that it's supposed to be? Is it all the way up here that it's supposed to be? Centered in the upper half of the page means that you cut your page in half, and then you cut it in half again, and then you put your title in the center of the upper half, right? Centered in the upper half of the page, that's what that means. Or you can just look at this and say, oh, okay, I get it, kind of like 3/4 of the way up. Let's make my title page look like this title page here. What we're not going to do, author's notes. Author's notes are usually when you submit this to a journal, they need to know who to contact, they need to know basically his contact information, who is the corresponding author, who do they go to when they have issues. We're not going to do that, so you don't have to worry about the author's note. Basically, your title page is going to look like this. The last thing I'll mention is that your title page is going to have your name. You're going to be the first author because you are doing the majority of the work on this project. I will be second author, so make sure that you include me because I did a large portion of this work, including the statistics. And one thing that I'll point out here, and this is one thing I really like about APA, you'll notice that none of these names here have any titles with them. So maybe they're people with their PhDs. Maybe they're undergrad students. Maybe they're a high school student that hasn't graduated even high school yet. Maybe they have a master's. Maybe they have an education degree. APA doesn't care. They're researchers, and they're listed in the order with which they contributed to the research. And I kind of like that. I like the fact that as long as you're making a contribution, that's how you're measured. It's not Dr. Janet Pollavy and the rest. It's Janet Pollavy and Peter and Rajbir, and they're all on the same page. So I like that. So as proud as I am of my PhD, I do not want to see Dr. Igor Yurichevich in the title there, but that's your title page. All right, page number 2, your abstract. Again, different than the published form. You'll notice that when you see a published article, number 1, the title is at the top of the page. Right below it is the abstract, and below that is where the introduction starts. In your manuscript form, the abstract gets its own page. I don't know why. I guess it made it easier for editors to read it back in the day, but that is the rule. Abstract gets its own page. Notice that the running head is still at the top, but no longer has the word running head. So again, nice little visual cue for that. Notice it's numbered at page number 2. The biggest thing with the abstract, and don't ask me why, this is again just one of those things about APA, is that that paragraph is not indented. That is one of the first things any editor or reviewer is ever going to see. They're going to see your abstract. And if they see an indent in that abstract, that's just a signal to them that you don't know APA style. So it might seem like a small thing. It is a small thing. Honestly, I don't think it's going to throw anybody off if you indent your abstract, but it's a signal that you don't know APA. So make sure that you don't indent your abstract. I'll give you an example of this from the world of entertainment. So you might have heard this about Van Halen, the rock and roll band. that they wouldn't, they wanted their dressing room to be set up in a certain way. And one of the things they did not want was brown M&Ms. They would not allow brown M&Ms. And if they walked into their dressing room and they saw brown M&Ms, that was it. You know, they would throw a fit. It would be crazy. Does anybody know why? Wes?
It's because, isn't it because they had a lot of complicated lighting equipment and stage stuff, and it was at the near the back of the rider, so that made sure if they rented all of it, they wouldn't have brown M&Ms, and they'd be sure that everything was set.
Exactly. They had a lot of complicated lighting equipment, stuff that could go wrong, stuff that might be dangerous, and they had it all spelled out, what they needed to do, the people that were setting up the arena. And in that agreement was also, we don't want any brown M&Ms. So rather than having to check 1,000 different lights and 1,000 different riggings, they could just walk into their dressing room. And if they saw no brown M&Ms, they were saying, these guys know what they're doing. They took care of everything. If they saw brown M&Ms, they were like, this is horrible. Who knows what's going to go wrong? That's your brown M&M right there. It's going to be one of the first things that I see. If I see an indentation, that's like seeing brown M&Ms in the bowl. I know this is probably not going to be good APA style. And the same thing with professional reviewers. If they see that indentation, it's like that signal. So don't indent. Make sure that you don't have that indentation. Abstract begins on a new page with the word abstract centered. And your abstract, there's generally a word length to your abstract. I'm going to show you how to write an abstract so you can always be within that word length and you get a full synopsis of the article. And basically the key is you get 1 to 2 sentences per section. So your abstract is going to be 4 sentences to 8 sentences long. We'll go over all these details when we're writing the abstract, but that's an easy way to not have to count the numbers and still be able to summarize the entire the entire paper. All right, this is your introduction. Notice introduction is not labeled introduction. Introduction is labeled with the title there. So again, just a nice little visual representation of what your introduction should look like. Still got the running head, still got the page numbers. And then what we're going to be taking a look at here, or things that we're going to be focusing on, citations, right? So these two here are citations, that's a citation, that's citation, that's citation. All 5 of these are about citations. Citations are going to be a big part when we write the introduction. We don't need them for the method section too much. We need 1 for the method section. We don't need them at all for the results section. But when you get into the discussion, you're going to cite a lot. And when you get into the introduction, you're going to cite heavily. Because the introduction is all about what other people did, what other theories people came up with, what other ideas people came up with, what other work people came up with. And the purpose of a citation is to show, give credit, that those were the people that came up with that idea. So for example here, they go, whereas unrestrained eaters, talking about self-regulating eating, whereas unrestrained eaters typically compensate by eating less after a larger preload than after a smaller one, restrained eaters often counter-regulate, eating more after a large preload than after a small preload or after no preload at all. This is not the author's idea. That's not their finding, that's not their work. Whose work is it? Well, it's Adams and Leary, it's Herman, Pahlavi, and Esses, it's Pahlavi, Heatherton, and Herman, Pahlavi, Herman, Hackett, and Kulshnick. It's their work. So we need to cite to show where we got our ideas from. And it's twofold. Number 1, we're giving credit. Number 2, if I read this sentence and I said, I don't believe it, I don't think that's true, well, the authors are basically saying, all right, go check with Adams and Leary if you need more information. Go look at Herman, Pahlavi, and Esses for their 1987 paper. They're letting you know where you can get more information if you want to check up on what they wrote. So there's a ton of citation rules. So you'll notice here in this multiple citation, it's alphabetical by first author. First author, second author, third author, those orders never change. You do not touch author order. It's like sacred. Whoever did the most work, first author. Whoever did the second most, second author, and so on down the line. You got to respect that. You don't get to move those around. But Adams comes before Herman. Herman comes before Pallavi. Pallavi comes before, Pallavi and Heatherton comes before Polly and Herman, right? So it's alphabetical according to author when you have multiple. It's, you use the ampersand for multiple authors, right? You don't use the word and. You use a semicolon to split the different publications. There's a lot of rules. You'll have them all listed out, but just be aware of them when we start getting into citations. You want to identify how many authors does it have in terms of how do you cite it. Is it in parentheses or is it in not parentheses? Those are the two big things. But we'll introduce that later. But again, if you're wondering, should I use et al, should I not use? Is et al with a period and then a comma, or is it just with a comma? Again, nice little visual aid. In terms of punctuation, we're not going to be focusing on that. So I assume that you have, the English skills. English 131 is prerequisite, but we won't be like stringent in checking up on certain aspects of punctuation. All right, so once again, citations going to be a big part of this. One of the first things we're going to do is headers. So when we write the method section, we got three subsections in that method section. One of the first things we're going to do is headers. So your major sections, they're your first level sections. They are centered and bolded. The next subsection, that is paragraph form, boldface, and flush to the left. And again, if you don't know what that means, right? Sometimes paragraph form, you might say, well, what's paragraph form? Again, shows you what it should look like. Use this resource. Numbers, there's a bunch of rules about numbers. The key thing that you want to know about numbers is that sometimes in APA form, they're written out as the numeral. Sometimes they're written out as the word. Here, 106 is written out as the numeral. In other situations, it will be written out, ONEHUNDREDSIX, right? It will be written out 106. So we'll go over those when we get into, we'll introduce those when we get into the, I believe, results section. But just be aware, whenever you're writing a number, check to make sure, do I write this as a numeral? Do I write this as a number? So one of the basic rules is that if it's 10 or above, you write it as a number. If it's below 10, you write it as a word. But there are other rules that counter that. So we'll see what those are when we get to that section. And you will see that there are a lot of numeral rules. So just be aware of that. When you write a number, ask yourself, should it be the number? Should it be the word? And that'll keep you in APA style. All right, notice here we have materials. That's a second level heading. Food here is a third level heading. So a third level heading would have indented, bold, paragraph form with a period at the end. Once again, if you're not sure what that means, right? Do I capitalize all the words or do I not capitalize all the words? Well, you don't, and you end it with a period. Do I hit return and then begin the paragraph underneath? No, you don't. You got it right here. So again, nice little visual aid for that. Define unfamiliar acronyms when they're first used, and then you spell them all out. We might use acronyms, we might not. Some of these APA criteria are going to be things that everybody's going to use. So everybody's going to use citations, everybody's going to write numbers, everybody's going to have headings. Other ones might come up if, depending upon what your content is. So we're not necessarily going to use acronyms, but if you do, make sure that when you use that acronym for the first time, spell it all out, give the citation and where it's from. That's the way that you use an acronym. The levels of subheadings here is telling you about bold and its paragraph form at the end of a period. One that we will use that I'll mention this when we're writing the method section, but your anchors of a scale are in italics. So when we say that we measured confidence on a scale, we give them the anchors. We say we measured confidence on a scale from 1, not at all confident, to 4, completely confident. Those phrases, not at all and completely, those are in italics. And this is a nice little feature because if I was trying to find what the anchors of a scale are, it would be very easy for me just to scan this and go, oh, boom, italics right there. Very slightly or not at all, up the way to 5 for extremely. It helps you navigate. So much of what we're doing with APA style, such as the headings, helps you navigate, helps you know if you're in a subsection of a subsection. The more you know about APA style, the easier it is to go through a paper and kind of know where you are. All right, so once again, second level section. So we were in the materials subsection. That section had a food subsection, questionnaire subsection, restraint scale subsection. Then we pop back out, and now we're in the procedure section. And again, you can see numbers less than 10. We have one larger slice rather than the number one largest slice. All right, and as I mentioned, there's a ton of rules with numbers. So the general rule, above 10, 10 or above, you write it as a number. 9 or below, you write it as a word. But if it comes with a unit of measurement, you write it as a number. So when we're talking about recall periods, and we're saying they had 2 minutes to recall, and the words were up on the screen for 2 seconds at a time, those twos, they're written out as numbers, not as the words. And again, you will see in your resources, there's just going to be a list of write it out as a numeral when, bum, 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 write it out as a number when, dun, 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 dun. And all you need to do is when you're writing it, say, I'm writing a number, what do I do? And then you check it, you reference it. All right, so we got the results section right here. Again, it's your next big section, center boldface. When we're writing results, we will go over how to write the stats here. So for example, statistical terms are presented in italics. That just makes them easier to identify. There's rules for when you have a 0 point something something or just point something something. We'll go over that. And again, statistical symbols such as the mean, such as the F statistic, those are presented in italics, such as the p-value here. So when you're doing this is a nice visual example. When you're doing your library assignment, when you're reading through, don't even read through. When you're scanning through, scan for it. And you should be able to scan down the center, find results. Look at your results. Well, there's a weird piece of statistical jargon. There's a p-value. There's m. Even if you don't know what those are, you know their stats. This is a primary research article, almost for sure. Actually, I've read it. It is for sure. All right. What else? Greek letters. Once again, don't worry about the kind of Greek letters here and stuff. In terms of what we're going to be writing, we're not going to need them. But again, there's partial eta squared. You might not know what a partial eta squared is, but you know it's stats. So we got that for our primary research article. We're going to have figures. So we are going to produce graphs of the results from our experiment. When you point to a table or you point to a figure, when you mention it, number one, it has to be mentioned in the order that they occur in the text. So the first time you go see figure this, it has to be see figure 1. The next one is see figure 2. You can't start off with see figure 2, right? It has to be ordered, it has to be numbered in the order that they occur. All right, and then again, we have our last major section, the discussion section. Quotation marks, you're not going to need to know about quotation marks, and I'll mention why in just a moment. And APA strongly encourages writers to use past tense for reporting procedures and results. There's a couple of rules about tenses that we'll mention, but in general, it's just kind of the same principles of good writing that you've been using, up until now as well, in terms of the actual prose, the actual writing of it. All right, the last big section that you're going to be working on is your references. And the references are where you mention everything that you've cited. So unlike a bibliography, where you might just report materials and resources that you used that were helpful, that you read but maybe didn't directly reference in your paper, in a scientific journal article, your references have to be cited. If you didn't cite it, it doesn't go into the references. If it's in the references, it has to be cited. If you cited it, it has to be in the references. So each one of these names appeared somewhere in the body of the text, right? So Knight and Boland, 1989. If Knight and Boland is mentioned here, they better have, there it is, Knight and Boland here in the references. So it's got to have that one-to-one correspondence. And there are a ton of rules about references. That one you don't need. But there's a tons of rules about references. Basically, it has to do with the authors and the date being presented. It has to do with the title being in paragraph form. Notice, no capitalizations, ends in a period. The journal is capitalized and in italics. And then you have the issue and you got the page numbers. That's the basic breakdown. But there's a lot of rules in terms of how many authors, what's the order that they're presented in, all that kind of stuff. But we'll get to that. That'll be one of the last things you put together. So whether you use a book or whether you get your data from your information from a book, whether you get it from an article, there's a reference style for each different type of information. So you will definitely have references for the articles that you find, that everybody will have. But if you find a book, like if you're looking through your textbook and you're like, oh my gosh, that's a great example, I'm going to use that in my introduction. You're going to cite that textbook, you need to reference it. Books are referenced different than journal articles. All right, so there's a bunch of rules there, and then there's rules for tables. So if you want to present your data in the form of a table, so if you want to present, the high levels of false memory confidence, for pairs and triples versus for individuals in a table, feel free. There are rules for how a table is set up, and APA has a nice little checklist. APA hates, they do not have vertical divisors. So that default word table that you can insert with its vertical lines, not APA style at all, no vertical lines in this one. And first words of headings, we won't worry about that. And your table note, you don't have to worry about that. For the table, all you need is the title of your table and the fact that it's table 1 and then the actual table itself. These notes are, extra stuff that we won't have to do. If, on the other hand, you choose to do figures, I like figures better. I usually don't use tables. You need to have the figure. It has to be figure number 1. You do need a caption. So there's rules on figure captions and how to number your figures throughout that process. All right, and again, that is one of your best resources. And anything in addition to what I mentioned here today, I will add them as we go through our section. So I will literally say, all right, we're getting ready to write the method section. Here's what goes into a method section. Here's the different parts of the method section you need. And here's a list of the APA stuff that we're going to be introducing for this method section. So don't at all think that for the first thing you write, you're going to have to do everything and you're going to have to check everything. That's going to be for the final paper. We're going to, again, add it in piece by piece. All right, are there any questions on, it's pretty straightforward, but are there any questions about anything we've gone over so far? All right, some final stipulations. So, first stipulation, no footnotes. So, footnotes are allowed in APA, and you might actually find an article that has footnotes in APA. We're not going to allow it for your assignment in this course, and the reason for that is there just really isn't a need. Footnotes are typically some anecdotal information, maybe a personal communication that you had at a conference, maybe some technical information that a typical reader wouldn't need, but if you're really interested, you can access the footnote. Let's make it easier for ourselves. We don't need footnotes, so there won't be any footnotes in your paper. The big one, I am not allowing quotes for your research paper. Absolutely no quotes whatsoever. And much like footnotes, quotes are allowed in APA style. You'll see entire sections on how to quote properly in APA style. The reason I don't allow quotes is because even though they're allowed in APA style, They're not allowed for this assignment because in the past, not everybody, but some students have just vastly overused and abused their use of quotes. So part of this course is learning how to write scientifically. Part of this course is figuring out how to paraphrase, how to present information in a clear manner, how to organize different sections of information. And to be honest, most students do that. This is just to protect me against those few students that sometimes say things like, or write a paper and it'll look like, Smith and Smith's theory of false memories states, and then they have like a block quote, an entire paragraph quote. And then at the end of that quote, it says, in response to this, Melvin and Johnson wrote, and then they have another block quote. So I end up with 98% quoted material, 2% of their own writing, and that's not learning how to write, that's not growing in your abilities. So it's hard to say, well, you can have 8% of your text quote, like it's just too hard. So for this, no quotes. It might be tempting to use a quote. I know that oftentimes in essay writings and things, that wonderful quote is just, one of the greatest things is to find that wonderful quote that works. Don't do it. If you're tempted to write a quote, rip the quotation key off your keyboard, because it will be heavily penalized. All right, I need to do it just to maintain the integrity of the writing aspect of this course. Quotes will be heavily penalized. Please do not fall into that trap. Don't quote, and that will be, and you'll do amazing. Any final questions on anything that we've gone over today? It's all good? All right. So that's it for what I wanted to cover today.